It's no secret, Japan has problems. Quite a few problems. But of all of them, one stands out strongly: the profound demographic crisis the country is experiencing. Japan seems doomed to gradually disappear. It's something we've already talked about some time ago here on VisualPolitik, and we'll leave you the video link in the description. Pay attention, for example, to this headline.
Japan's population drops by nearly 800,000, with falls in every prefecture for the first time.
Although foreign residents have increased by 10% over the last 14 years, during the same time period, the Japanese population has fallen steadily every year. In fact, estimates suggest that over the next 40 years, Japan will lose almost 40 million inhabitants, 1 million people per year on average. Of course, during this time, the population will also be getting older and older. Now, some of you may be thinking, but Josh, what on earth has all of this got to do with the title of this video? Weren't we supposed to be talking about the Japanese self-defense forces? Well, you see, the reality is that this demographic crisis affects all areas: economic, political, and yes, also the military. According to some analysts, the demographic decline that will occur both in Asia and in much of the developed world could lead to a situation of forced peace. This is what some refer to as the geriatric peace. According to these analysts, the aging of the population will generate a new geopolitical stability, especially since both China and Russia are also facing serious demographic problems. This theory suggests that, as there will be fewer young people available in the labor force, priority will be given to those working in the productive economy in order to sustain the welfare system. Remember that in very old populations, health and dependency costs skyrocket, and this has to be sustained by someone. Precisely for this reason, this theory holds that there will be fewer young people available and also willing to join the armed forces or to do military service. As a result, according to this theory, countries will become more reluctant to act aggressively, opting instead for diplomatic solutions to problems. Now, why does this all make sense? Well, maybe in some places this theory is true. Apart from that, I'm sorry, but at this point, we won't be the ones to endorse this theory one way or another. Now, in Japan, which has the highest percentage of elderly people, so they must know something about all of this, they don't seem to buy into this theory very much either. Want to know why? Well, pay close attention, because in this third video made in collaboration with Harvard International Review, we will tell you how Japan's self-defense forces expect to be reinforced at a time where there will be far fewer troops available. We're talking about Japan's techno-army. Listen up.
Fewer men, more machines.
Take a look at this graph. Far from declining in recent years, particularly since 2017, Japan's military spending relative to GDP has not stopped increasing. In 2020, it reached 1% of GDP for the first time since the late 1950s, and that is nothing compared to what is coming. Japan's plan is to increase its military spending to about 2% of GDP in accordance with the NATO standard by 2027. This is a lot of money. Keep in mind that Japan has a huge economy. We're talking in the medium term about $40 to $50 billion more in military spending every year. So Japan's self-defense forces will become the third largest in the world in terms of budget. We are talking about a military gamble that not only shows us that demographic aging will not necessarily lead to a reduced presence of the armed forces, but may even lead to the opposite. Why? Well, if we look at Japan, we will find one possible answer. The future lack of personnel in the armed forces is to be replaced by technology and machines, a change that entails spending an enormous amount of money. To give you an idea, Japan wants to inject some $321 billion between 2023 and 2027 into its armed forces. And yes, this is a ton of money. Japan's objective, as set out in its latest national defense strategy, which dates from 2022, is to create armed forces that are smaller in number but far more lethal. In other words, to turn a normal military into a military of elite units, well-trained, very well equipped, and with a high level of technology. And it is also something that is to be achieved by using mostly indigenous technology. To this end, the Japanese government expects to ramp up military R&D spending, while also tapping into civilian R&D as never before. It is a total paradigm shift. But why all this? And why does Japan suddenly want to get its act together? Well, apart from the demographic challenge, the explanation can be found first and foremost in China. Japan feels more and more vulnerable to China's growing military capabilities and the increasingly hostile discourse of Beijing's top brass with the West, not only in military but also in political terms. Indeed, it is striking that the land of the rising sun, despite being the world's third largest economy, seems to have little international influence. Think about it. Do you ever take Tokyo's opinion into account in major international debates? Exactly. If we were to remove its membership in the G7, we would be talking about a country that really has very little influence in the international political sphere. Countries like Germany or Canada, with their smaller economies, have much more international weight. Even South Korea, which has become a major supplier in the defense and civilian energy sectors, already rivals Japan in political influence. And that VisualPolitik community is something that the Japanese government now wants to change as well. More recently, with its entry into the military alliances such as the Quad, this situation is being reversed, but more is needed. And having a truly capable armed forces could be critical for this, both for international influence and for national security itself. As we've already mentioned on several occasions, Beijing has been carrying out a very accelerated military modernization process in recent years. The Chinese armed forces are increasingly better equipped. Some military analysts even put a date for China to be ready to invade Taiwan if it wanted to, 2027. And obviously, given the experience with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, these days military threats by giants against smaller and weaker countries have begun to be taken much more seriously. In the case of Taiwan, a hypothetical Chinese invasion would have serious implications for Japan. Not only would it leave its southwestern islands much more exposed to Beijing, but the effects on the Japanese economy could be devastating. Taiwan produces many of the semiconductors and a great deal of the most advanced technology demanded by Japanese industry. And there are many Japanese companies that manufacture on the island directly. If that supply were to be cut off, the blow could be lethal. And naturally, we can't forget North Korea either, which has already shown itself capable of attacking any part of Japan with nuclear-capable missiles. But wait a minute, because if you thought that we were simply going to tell you in this video that Japan wants to buy more modern weapons, the truth is that this is just the beginning. Japan's plan to achieve an armed forces totally different from what we know today goes much further. For example, the Japanese Ministry of Defense recently published the 2023 Defense Technology Guideline. We are talking about a document that radically changes the way in which the armed forces relate to the private economy, to universities, and even to the government itself. What we are going to tell you now is sure to surprise more than one of you. VisualPolitik viewers, this is how Japan hopes to become one of the world's most innovative countries in defense. Stay tuned.
A beta force.
Okay, I don't think it will be very surprising if I tell you that the Japanese armed forces have major capability problems after years and years, decades of underfunding. You see, following the fall of the Japanese Empire and the dropping of atomic bombs by the United States to force the country's capitulation in World War II, Japanese society was completely traumatized. The country, with which the last century was a militarist and imperialist regime that caused a huge trail of destruction and death across half of Asia, is now one of the most pacifist countries on the planet. In fact, an overwhelming majority of the Japanese population were against increasing defense spending. In the early 2010s, barely a quarter of Japanese people favored increasing defense spending. Today, however, that figure has risen to more than 60%. From sushi to guided missiles, Japanese tastes have changed dramatically in just 10 years. Well, the question now is that in order to materialize the budget increase in the form of results, the government of Fumio Kishida, who incidentally descends from a family with roots in Hiroshima, the most pacifist and anti-militarist city in the country, has traced a very unusual path: the techno-army. You see, until now, the Japanese military has focused on developing its own conventional weaponry. We're talking about tanks, ships, and combat aircraft. However, at the same time, Japan's most direct threat, which is China, has been working on unconventional and highly technological weapons, such as directed energy weapons like lasers, electromagnetic weapons, railguns, and drones of all kinds.
Chinese Navy is testing the most powerful coil gun ever built. Coil guns, also known as magnetic accelerators, could bring massive changes to the way wars are fought, paving the way for more devastating attacks on enemy targets. China claims electromagnetic railgun development over rivals US, Japan.
We already talked about some of these super weapons in a past video that we'll link for you in the description. The fact is that all this, coupled with the increasingly aggressive rhetoric of the Chinese regime, has made the Japanese realize that it is very, very possible that if things continue as they are, they would soon be unable to cope with aggression from Beijing. And of course, they would not be able to defend their interests in the region either. For example, they would not be able to do anything about Taiwan. Their deterrence capability would be nil. So the big question we can ask is, what is the solution that Tokyo has proposed? Well, basically to take advantage of one of its great strengths as a nation and to trigger research and development into new types of weaponry, but not in the way it has been going on so far. Until now, the Self-Defense Forces communicated to the Ministry of Defense what capabilities they needed. Then, the ministry studied which weapons would be preferred and commissioned private contractors to develop and manufacture them. Then, for years, the defense industry built prototypes that were tested and tested ad nauseum and improved until the final model was achieved. Then, that final model had to undergo certification by the Ministry of Defense before entering service. The fact is that this process could take between 10 and even 20 years before the weapon became operational. During all that time, many technologies also emerged that were simply left out of the final product. One example is the Type 90 tank, a weapon that took the Self-Defense Forces 13 years to deploy from the time it was requested until the final design was completed. In other words, the result with this production design tended to be an outdated product, or at least one that was no longer at the cutting edge of the military industry. This is a design and development model known as the waterfall model. Each step of the process follows one after the other, and the next one does not start until the previous one is completed. Well, this is exactly what Japan's Ministry of Defense wants to do away with, to put an end to the waterfall model once and for all. But how can this be done? Basically, in a way that may be surprising to some of you, and may even shock others. We are talking about promoting the merger of military R&D and civilian R&D, or at least that is what is being proposed in practice. And I know what many of you may be thinking. But isn't this something similar to what China is doing? Well, in essence, yes, but with nuances. As always, the devil is in the details. On a 10-year horizon, Japan wants private companies with an R&D component, as well as universities, to join public research institutions and agencies, both civilian and military, as well as the Ministry of Defense itself, to work side by side. The aim is that the most advanced civilian technologies, such as the best drones, artificial intelligence, or numerous big data analysis software, can be quickly merged and integrated to create remote and even autonomous weapons. The idea is to achieve technological superiority and at the same time reduce to a minimum the number of humans needed to carry out military operations. Or in other words, to put more machines on the battlefield if needed and fewer people.
Japan launching Defense Tech Research Agency Advancing Railgun Project.
All of the above would have at least a couple of advantages and a couple of disadvantages. The first advantage is that, in a scenario of aging and decreasing population, Japan could maintain and even improve its defense capabilities, which was not believed possible under the geriatric peace theory. The second advantage is that, in the event of a conflict, far fewer Japanese lives would be at risk. But it also has some disadvantages. The first, of course, is the cost. Developing a military with these capabilities is gonna be very expensive. We'll eat up a good part of the $321 billion in military spending until 2027. And then the second disadvantage it may have is the desensitization and dehumanization of war. This could ultimately translate into more civilian casualties in the event of conflict and more bloody wars. In other words, a very different result than expected. Now, is all this realistic? I'm sure many of you are thinking, wow, oh my, what a blockbuster the Japanese are making, right? Because the truth is that, in the absence of more concrete plans, the guidelines seem very serious, and Japan's armed forces will go down that road during this decade and the one to come. In fact, one of the main pillars of this new strategy is that the waterfall model of weapons development be banished forever. According to this new approach, weapons developed jointly by the defense industry and the civilian sector would become operational in the self-defense forces at the prototype stage. As soon as they had real combat functionalities, they would start to be used. Then it would be the reports from the armed forces themselves that would be used to improve these prototypes over the years until they reached a fully functional final product. It is a system of continuous development. In other words, an armed forces in constant beta phase. Now, why do they want to do this? Why such a rush? Well, basically, because of what we've already mentioned. The Japanese believe that China is rapidly closing the gap in military technology, and they have to squeeze whatever it takes to maintain their deterrence and combat capability. On top of that, the new plan also calls for all new weaponry developed by Japan to be of NATO standards, in order to improve interoperability with its allies and facilitate the export of new weaponry that is developed. Now, at this point, do you want some concrete examples of what Japan has in store under this new scheme? Well, you see, apart from improving the railgun, which has already been tested on a ship, Japan is looking to develop a series of new, unconventional, unmanned, and even autonomous weapons. Ultra-connected weapons linked to networks such as 5G that could be used from thousands of kilometers away, taking advantage of the very low latency of these new networks. But there is more. One of the first things they want to put into operation is a high-power microwave system. No, not the type to cook your dinner. We're talking about a directed energy weapon that would, in Japan's case, deal with saturation drone attacks. It also seeks to prioritize the use of unconventional types of energy to operate the weaponry, and the creation of new materials, in theory, much more highly perfected. In fact, the recently published guidelines refer to the development of a new material that is not only stronger, but has a perfect microstructure that could even regenerate itself. But Japan's ideas for the future are not just about technologies applicable to offensive weaponry. They're also looking to use much less common weapons than you might imagine. An example? Well, Japan wants to create real systems for spreading false information. Yes, that's right, the good old fake news, but taken to another level. Let me explain. Through artificial intelligence, the metaverse, and very advanced deepfake technologies, or even through the projection of stereoscopic holograms, Japan wants to deceive the enemy, both on and off the battlefield, by dispersing this information to make people believe things that are not true and to gain an advantage in the event of a conflict. They even talk about projecting objects as if they were real. We're talking about technologies that, to a greater or lesser extent, are already being used in the civilian sphere, but which Japan's military wants to adopt, adapt, and improve to the maximum extent possible in order to turn them into weapons. Maybe for many of you, all of what we are telling you sounds crazy. And don't think I don't understand. But let me just say one thing. Everything we are telling you about appears in the new defense technology guideline. So yes, this is what Japan has in mind. The big question we all probably have is, will they succeed? Will Japan's armed forces become futuristic, ultra-connected, and super mechanized? Well, only time will tell. And what's certain is that we will be talking about it here on VisualPolitik. And for the moment, you can leave your opinions about what we have told you below in the comments. So I really hope that you found this new VisualPolitik Harvard International Review collaboration as interesting and fascinating as we did. If so, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Thank you so very, very much for watching. All the best, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.